Nice to be, nice to be honored by dessert. Well, welcome. Whoa, Heidi, that's probably just a little high. Is that a little meh? Is that okay? Oh, you want it higher? It's almost blowing me away here. Just a smidgen down more, Heidi. Just a smidgen. Yeah. Okay. That's better. I don't want to blow it away. Welcome on Mother's Day. Nice to have nice weather for it. I guess we're supposed to have rain next week again. Shocking. Oh yeah, we can. I'm assuming Steve did that with Nick because Nick was in communication and they had determined what it was, and so Steve must have come in after you got the part somewhere. Nick says, yeah, it's really just not a very expensive part, $40, but I guess in context of technology, that probably is pretty cheap. So I'm thinking when I came in this morning, I turned everything on. I go, is it going to work? And it did. So they must have got that part replaced that allowed the internet to relay in and blah 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 and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure I'm doing a very poor job explaining it with that. But anyhow, praise the Lord that it's. Pardon? No, I know I don't. Well, as we've been looking at the crossroads and Boston and the iterations after that, we've been seeing that some of those basic things that were happening was that they were kind of taking on the old restoration view that we are looking at the scriptures and rediscovering these truths that got lost. And so among a people that had done that and been there and done that, there were those that felt that they're doing the same thing that they did 150 years before. And I just kind of find that interesting. And so some of the things that contributed to their understanding of things different is, first of all, this passion to reach out, evangelism, and felt that was very much lacking. And so that because that was important to them, and they felt that in the mainline churches that was lukewarm at best, that they felt that validated who they were and what they were to the point of being kind of exclusive among those that were exclusive. And so that was one of the things. What also enabled that was how they viewed what was called the silence of the scriptures. And in the Church of Christ wing of things of the Restoration Movement, that tended to be where you need authority to be able to do anything. And so unless the scriptures tell you can do it, you shouldn't do it. And so that's called the silence of the scriptures. Well, another interpretation of which the Christian churches and the disciples, and obviously this iteration did, was where the scriptures are silent, there is freedom to do what you want, because it doesn't tell us. It gives us free reign, so to speak, of what to do. And so that made things very different. And of course, in the 90s, after they've kind of split away from Churches of Christ generally, they started using instruments, and so their congregations now are instrumental, which of course was, you just didn't do that. And so that was because of that, looking at that and that understanding that they had. And so, but then as I said, it got down to discipling, and one of the things that we ended last week on was this interpretation of basically Matthew 28, that so changed things, and that was, you know, he came to this understanding that disciple, you have to be a disciple, and that equals Christian, and thus that equals saved. And so he interpreted the Matthew 28 as basically you need to be a disciple before you are immersed, and so on and so forth, instead of you know, become a Christian and then you're taught, you know, baptized and taught and so on and so forth as was understood. Well, this understanding, and of course if you know, talking to people like Jerry, who knows how to, you know, this participle and that and all the breaking down of the words and the language and the grammar and all that, that isn't the way it reads. And yet, you know, he says you're supposed to, you know, this is how you become a disciple rather than you're a disciple first. Well, and why was that? Because the idea was that a disciple is one that is reaching out, that is evangelizing, that's the most critical thing that a disciple can do. And if you're not doing that, then maybe you aren't a disciple, and thus maybe you aren't a Christian in the first place. And so what happened when this understanding developed and grew and became almost codified, if you will, that there was many in a movement that was supposedly teaching and requiring the most and so on and so forth, that wasn't enough. And that they became or were being rebaptized. Not just those from the main line coming from within or from outside. And I know in Kirksville we kind of experienced some of that. You know, because those of us who are here, well, we did it right in the first place. And those were coming in, well, maybe you really weren't so right. And we've got to make sure you understand it right. And so on and so forth. Well, that started happening then within the movement of those that had been baptized with that understanding. And there was many leaders that were baptized and so rebaptized and so on, and they still stayed in those positions. Because, well, they were doing it anyway, was what was said. And so this was huge and very significant. And, of course, they would always boast of these high numbers of people becoming Christians, and there was, and I'm not disputing that. But it was interesting that when you had the rebaptism, they also counted those again. And so you had real padded numbers. That was always kind of interesting. But anyhow, so this was a critical thing behind this. Some things I was further looking into is that if you know, looking at it from this point and looking back, you saw that there was kind of like a 10-year cycle that it's, you know, they got going, was really exciting, lots of things happening, lots of growth, and then it kind of started not being as expanding and as growing and so on and so forth. And so that happened at Crossroads. That happened, not that it stopped, but it wasn't along those lines. And in Boston, the same thing happened. And so whenever that happened, then there was kind of a, you know, pressure coming down saying, why isn't it happening more? Yes, Joe. How would you define disciple? Would I? I would say a follower of Jesus. Yeah. Well, they might say it was more. Yeah, yeah.
Who's they?
The leadership, Kip McKean, and the leadership, because there was a great, you know, you had to conform to the way things were, and if not, you were talked to and things like that. And so there was a demand for a uniformity. There was not a broad diversity of thought and understanding.
Yeah, I would think we use follow
Pardon?
I think we use follower in too many ways sometimes though, because there were crowds that would follow Jesus because of the excitement, and then they would fall away.
Yeah.
And then there was disciples who were following Jesus, but it was a little bit more than just that generic sense. They were wanting to become more.
Sure.
Much more committed.
More committed. Like there was this idea of you're a disciple of somebody, you're trying to learn what they're teaching and apply it
Yes.
Yourself.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, totally. On what you're saying. And again, in all of this that we've been talking about, remember, there's still kind of a spectrum depending on where you're at, depending on sometimes the personality of the leader. Some are maybe a little more kind, some are a little bit more, and things like that. And people are in different places. And so, but again, this was a crux of that.
But if you go back to Jesus
Mhm.
and say the apostles, the 12,
Okay.
that he talked closer,
Mm-hmm.
he was a rabbi to them.
Uh-huh.
And if you know that history of rabbis and how they taught, and then you get the idea of the following.
Well, and then that's a big part in the understanding of what was called, what they were defining as discipleship.
Their discipleship within that movement required more of a commitment than we generally see in the churches of Christ
Sure.
universal. They required those young people to be involved at a level that a lot of our young people wouldn't want to be involved or wouldn't willingly be involved in.
Sure. And they're viewing that as
I don't think we
righteousness.
lose sight of that when we talk about it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, very, very much. Bill?
I've just gone through the concordance here. I'm not near through it completely, but most of it. Under the words disciple, discipleship, or disciples.
Uh-huh.
And in no cases is there indication or reference to someone being a disciple and they're not a follower of Christ.
Sure.
Secondly, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name, okay? We're all familiar with that verse.
Uh-huh.
We're making disciples, and how are we doing that?
Yes.
We're teaching them, we're baptizing them, and they become a follower and disciple themselves. And therefore you've made, or that God has made a disciple. And living through this era, I don't know, sometimes I want to call it an error in my life. And looking at being somebody that showed a lot of interest and support in some of these offshoots that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest mistake that I made, I forgot the instruction that we were to be one church. That was my biggest sin. And being one church, I am a part of the church.
Sure.
And if I'm off on so many different tangents that it becomes such a distraction and a splitting, a falling away of members by distraction of the evil one through this process, I've sinned. And that's the greatest problem that I have with all these different, separations today.
Yeah. Well, but again, it depends on how you interpret that. They would say that, hey, we're the remnant because we're doing the most. We're the most committed. We're the most this. We're the most that. We're demonstrating those things. And so depends how, the perspective you're taking. I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but they would take a thing and turn that on its head. And again, it's not that all this doesn't have some foundations to it, because it does. But it's just interesting. And so third, like traditional Churches of Christ, the ICOC, and so as we said, by the mid-90s, they had totally separated from Churches of Christ and named themselves the International Churches of Christ. And they placed great emphasis on good works understood as discipleship, with a little sense of grace and mercy. In other words, it was very produce-oriented. It was very, very driven that way. You know, I remember, you know, we would meet together a lot with our prayer partners or a meeting or things like that, and you always ask, how many people have you asked today? How many Bible studies are you involved in right now?
That was all numbers.
It was a lot of numbers. You know, have you read your Bible today? And, you know, you were busy and all that, and you hadn't, and so you quickly, you know, read a few sentences on the way there so you can say you read your Bible that day. And so, you know, just to relieve yourself of the pressure and that kind of stuff. And so, you know, that maybe wasn't everybody, but that was not, those kind of things were not uncommon in this kind of system. And so anyhow, and so again, it was about that and less about love and grace. In other words, love and grace were shown by you doing those things rather than, you know, being shown. And so it was, and again, as we've seen, they didn't come up with this themselves. This was learned in our history. There was some foundation behind some of that. So anyhow, further, in its efforts to sustain total commitment of its members, it kept in place a system we said called discipleship partners that had been implemented by the earlier Crossroad movement. And it was this system that drew the claims of, you know, you're being cultish and so on and so forth. Now, some of it is exactly like you were saying. The foundation of the reason we're doing this is look at the disciples and Jesus. Jesus met with them, Jesus talked with them, Jesus corrected them, Jesus, you know, and so on and so forth. Well, that's what that was supposed to be. And so,
None of us are
pardon?
killing Jesus.
100%. Yeah. And so in the minds, hey, this is exactly what the scriptures are saying. And it's not that that's totally nuts. And so they usually put someone that was supposedly more mature in the faith, but in a movement that was so rapidly growing, maturity in the faith might have been they became a Christian 3 months earlier. And as we all know, over time, you know, when we're young, we think, as my dad used to say, you know, you've just learned enough to be dangerous. That was his phrase. And so as we get older, we start realizing that, hey, I didn't know as much as I thought I did. I'm not the end-all, be-all that I thought I was. And so, you know, and you hopefully gain a little humility over life experiences. Well, where was that opportunity for that to happen in that way? That only happens through life experiences, you know. And so that was to me one of the shortcomings of at least the way this was reiterated. And of course, you were expected to do what your lead prayer partner said, and so on and so forth. And it was often, not always, but sometimes it could be a little one way. And things like that, but you know, it was kind of the system. But nonetheless, what was the purpose of that? Discipling was to help you quit, you know, not sin as much. Good thing. You know, being concerned about and reaching out. Good thing. It's not that those things weren't important or good. You know, we see in the Bible, iron sharpens iron. You know, we're familiar with some of those directives, if you will, and I think that's Proverbs. Is that Proverbs? Iron sharpens iron. Is that Proverbs? Okay. And so these admonitions and things, and just, you know, that was what ran them. Uh-oh. What's going on? There we go. So Flavel Yakeley, a leader among the traditional churches, and one of Boston Movement's chief critics, complained that the word discipling is used in this movement to mean much more than making converts. And it was used primarily to describe a system of intense training and close personal supervision of the Christian being discipled, and that person being discipled and taught to submit and to imitate the discipler. And that was true. Why? Well, because they're more mature in it. They're more practiced. You should be like them, because a disciple is supposed to be like their teacher. And so on a small scale, that was certainly the understanding, and that's how that system worked. And, I mean, long ago, and even what they're trying to do here. Christians being discipled are required to confess their sins to the discipler, and such confession is followed by rebuke, correction, admonition, prayer. And if the person being discipled seems reluctant To confess sins, the disciple are asked probing personal questions to elicit confession. And so, we look at that, hey, sometimes you gotta have hard talks, in our life and things like that. And so that's not, totally crazy, but nonetheless, it seemed that those things happen. And so then, someone would come up with other ideas for you, like who you should date. I think you should get with. I think you two would be a great match. And things like that. And we know people who said, we married because they really wanted us to. And then there was issues that happened afterwards, and so on and so forth. Not saying all that didn't work or things, but there were certainly cases of those kind of things. And again, from one line, they're thinking, hey, we're, trying to help out. It's a good thing, but nonetheless, we've got to figure those things out, as we well know. And so fourth, Kit McKean led the Boston movement to embrace an organizational structure that was radically different from our tradition. And of course, we've discussed this quite a bit previously. And what was that? Well, because, and remember, we said everything's viewed through a lens. And so our founders, if you will, coming from Europe, and that whole system of the state, and the clergy was just like the state, and all that kind of stuff, and the directives coming down from above, and all that, greatly influenced, as we read the scripture, and that idea of our autonomous piety, as it's called. In other words, each congregation is autonomous. In other words, that congregation over there can't tell us what to do, even though they often try to, right, in our history. But nonetheless, is that we're autonomous. We make the decisions for the congregation, as opposed to the structures that we often see associated with what we call denominationalism. And of course, we've always said, hey, we're not denominational because we don't have that structure. Well, it's more than just a structure, but nonetheless. And so they went away from that. And so you had Boston became the mother church. Crossroads kind of opposed things, so Kip just took the reins and said, I'm the head honcho. And why could he do that? Well, because we're being the most effective. We're reaching the most. Look at our numbers, so on and so forth. And so they had this system, this hierarchical system of you had, the mother church, then you had the other ones like Chicago and, the other places, and then sprinkled on down. And so that church plant we were on, that was planted by the church in Columbia, South Carolina, and we came back. That was before this was fully going on, if you will, or became the norm. And so when we were here and had planted it, eventually we were given over to Chicago, because Chicago was the place that was over all these plantings in the Midwest, like Kansas City, and so on and so forth. And so that kind of went in the mix. And I was told that in one presentation, I can't remember if I heard it or somebody just told me this, but that, Kit McKean says, now be ready. He said, I know this is going to sound a whole lot like the Catholic Church, meaning in the sense of structure. And so on the world stage, they would divide things up into the world sector leaders, where you had, France, or, Europe, Africa, and then on down as you go. And of course, he was at the top. He kind of oversaw everybody. Everything kind of went through him.
Saw himself as the Pope.
Well, as some from the outside said. And so we've seen throughout the study, and the onset of the 19th century, traditional churches of Christ have practiced, as we said, a radically different way of looking at that. I listened to a podcast that was talking about that, and I found this interesting. I think I mentioned this last week, was that, of course, we came to that conclusion of not only autonomous congregations, but of the eldership directing everything was very influenced by those European experiences. Well, what happened here in going away from that is that the congregations became very preacher or pastor driven, if you will. And the elders were kind of less, and they were kind of under his directive. So the point is, not necessarily trying to debate whether that's right or wrong, but rather big change, big way of doing things differently. And so, instead of things keeping accountable, the preachers ran things, so to speak. What am I doing here? Heidi, am I stuck here? But the ICOC devised altogether a different organizational strategy. Now, again, why was this? Well, look at what's happening. It's working. God is blessing this, so it must be right. Now, I want to believe that God can bless all kinds of things. I think that God can work in things that seem to be terrible at times. I mean, I think God can do those things. But anyhow, and so this different strategy, coupled with concern to provide effective care and governance for the far-flung membership, McKean devised a hierarchical system, as we said, and worked this out. And so, yes, Bill.
Oftentimes throughout what we know as the history, the Old Testament, we're given the example, and I think the same thing holds true today, or I guess I wouldn't be saying this. God gives us a pretty long rope. And with that rope, we can travel as distant in any direction we choose. We're given a freedom of choice by God's hand. Because he knows if we're going to be his followers eventually, we're going to go to our knees and say, Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. Give me a new direction. Help me to walk in the light of your Son, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But until that end, in most examples that you have in the Bible, it's not like somebody did something wrong and they're immediately punished.
Yeah.
God lets it play out.
Give an opportunity to, sure. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
What was that, Joe?
I thought he was gonna say that God starts pulling the rope back in.
Oh. That might be also true.
I think we always, a lot of congregations make the mistake of thinking growth is a blessing. And by that mentality, we should all be Catholic. They're still the largest. God has blessed them, so that's obviously correct. If we looked at the trajectory, the Charismatics and the Eastern Orthodox are the fastest growing in the U.S. right now. Is that a blessing? Like, should we all start doing that just because they're growing fast? It must be from God.
And certainly in Africa and in,
Yeah.
well, or some might say from the other point of view is, who's to say that he's not?
And
Blessing them.
You'll see the Catholics start picking up just because they picked a new pope, and it'll generate some excitement, and they'll say, see, they're blessing the pope. Yeah.
Sure.
We've all, even Church of Christ, we've made that mistake of assuming growth is because we're doing things right.
Everybody has, for sure. Good point, Dan. Yes, Carl.
I just found the scripture,
Okay.
but when I went to hear Ira Rice in Overland Park, Kansas, or somewhere over there in Kansas, when I was in college, I was going to listen to hear the other side of the story. So I heard a lot, being in college
Yeah.
and all this kind of stuff. And Matthew 20. Jesus was talking to the folks, his disciples. Says, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. And Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not
So with you.
among you. And boy, I'd never heard a speaker so loud. That
So that's what Ira Rice said?
Yeah, he was reading.
Okay.
He was pretty, talking about this lordship and
Yeah, yeah.
leadership within the church and, you know, this person, that person, your disciple or your discipler, you know, all these folks, your prayer partner, all this delineation of
Uh-huh.
authority. Said, instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant.
Hmm.
And whoever wants to be first must be a slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and give him a life as a ransom for many. So, as servants, the business of taking up your cross,
Mm-hmm.
of what authority do we have to lord it over anybody?
Well, they
in
would-
terms of religious authority or something like that. I mean, we have one authority,
Yes.
that's Christ.
And again, all these things can be interpreted differently depending on the lenses you're looking through them as. And I'm not disagreeing with you.
Just try to take it at
I-
value.
Well, sure.
The problem is, it's so easy to say, well, I'm not lording it over you. This is out of love. I'm trying to help encourage you. I'm trying to teach you. On the outside, like, you know, you're lording it over them, but it's so in the eye of the beholder to take that and say, that's not what he's not talking about. You can't have
Yes.
authority. He's talking about the attitude on how you use it.
Sure.
So,
But
and
when-
they're going to see the attitude as love and grace.
But when, as I had a conflict with an individual at work one time, I told him, I said, you're not my father. Don't talk to me like that. Where does it end? I can take someone's good graces
Yeah.
as a suggestion and think about his Holy Spirit opening up some ideas and saying, hey, another discernment. But when somebody's pushing me,
Sure.
pushing me, and it's against my will, then I've either got to come to a point where I understand what's going on and submit,
Mm-hmm.
or I just say, look, back off. I mean, some things in a person's life are personal,
Sure.
and they don't need to be discussed outside of the clinical environment if it turns to that.
Mm-hmm.
The prying and just the longing to get inside your head and all that kind of stuff is just a little much.
Yeah, and it's different for different people. But I think the point you're making, Daniel, is really good, because how many times have we shown examples in our history where people were blasting other people and saying they're doing that because they love you. That's why I'm blasting you. And it's like, wait a minute.
That's not love.
Yet, I mean, and maybe, and we've maybe done those things too, in our own life.
I've had brothers and sisters,
Yeah.
dear friends, who they don't have to pull me aside. They just make a comment.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking,
Sure.
the Spirit's saying, look, wake up here.
Sure. So, and again, it gets complicated, and we could, dissect and the different experiences and all this kind of stuff, and, just like, and we can also give examples of, when we're being disciplined, we hate it and everything else, and later on we see the value in it. So, I mean, those things happen too. But nonetheless. And so as part of this structure, he also specified in each congregation that the lead evangelist worked with and for the most part led and discipled the elders to direct affairs of the church. Well, I might say that's not totally nuts, because was it Titus or Timothy? He said, go and appoint elders. Okay, now, maybe one's saying they're expanding that beyond belief, but nonetheless. And the model continued until the big split that happened in around 2002. And they changed that structure. There was a letter that was written by one of the guys I think in London, Henry Creedy, and he put forth all these complaints, concerns, problems, and so on and so forth, and that led to Kip McKean's ouster. And I remember Jerry Jones telling me something, they're acting like this is all brand new, and if I had it documented in my books back in the 80s. But again, how often even in our own life do we not see at the time, but maybe see later? But anyhow, and so these things happen, and so as I think I mentioned before, what happened when this happened, this caused tremendous upheaval in the ICOC at this time when this happened. And
how did they oust him then?
I think I don't know if it was the elders, and he was in Los Angeles now.
But I mean, he's the big guy, right?
He's a big guy, because they did. I can't explain all the particulars, but they did, and he had things in his life that were not right.
Oh, really?
That was part of it. It wasn't just a power thing. And so it just all kind of culminated and things like that. And so that caused them a great deal of challenge and, upheaval and so on and so forth. And they were spinning their wheels for a while. And so, though originally designed to revitalize Churches of Christ, these various strategies of the ICOC increasingly led to a break, as we said, a break from the Churches of Christ in the mid-90s. But then there was this break also that happened. And so the Boston movement viewed themselves as we're the true church and nobody else is, because we're doing all this stuff right and whoever is not. And then so they broke away in the ICOC, and then a few years ago, shortly after this, a congregation, as I think I mentioned, in Portland, brought him in, even though he'd been ousted, one of the ICOC churches, and they formed what they called the International Churches of Christ. And this is about 10 years ago, I think, or longer than that. And they just went through a big split within the past year, because one of the things they did was they ousted Kip McKean again and had all kinds of sin problems and things like this. And so those that left and split there formed, I think I mentioned this, Restored Church Worldwide. I mentioned, I think, last week that I just found out about. And they just restored him again. So here it just keeps coming back and back and back. And probably doing the same things that he always did. And then when you see the terminology and all that, they change it a little bit, but it's the same stuff.
And it brings new meaning to it. 70 times 7, I guess.
And things like that.
The tragedy is, it's still all founded on personalities and the idea of, I've got it right.
As opposed to the person.
If anybody in the world is smart enough to be able to take God's word and say, I've got it right.
Yeah.
King Henry VIII did that once.
Yeah, he did.
He had him.
No.
Anyway, but I mean, just,
All because of personal
Yeah.
desires and
yeah.
reasons.
Well, and that was something Carl Ketcherside always said. It's really more about all these personalities. And of course, as we've documented all along, we've always had those personalities and realized they've been in every group. If we went into a detailed history of Baptist church history, I'm sure we would see similar kinds of things and stuff like that certainly happening. Or it could be worse. And so, as I said, in the mid-90s, there was no fellowship. They had broken away. Now, the more traditional churches of Christ, on the other hand, though still tied to the language of sectarian orthodoxy, in other words, we still talked like this is the right way. We're the right ones. We're restoring. That even though in practice we were all embracing lots of other stuff. And again, I'm not saying sinful stuff. I'm saying different stuff than had been the tradition. And by the 90s, few in the mainstream tradition had much interest in the total commitment, at least of the Boston church, defined it. But even if they had shared this commitment, the changes implemented by the ICOC were enough to sever fellowship with nearly every other group among the Churches of Christ. Now, when this big split happened in the early 2000s, they tried to reconcile. And there were some things in Abilene that they, I forgot what they call them, but there were these talking, getting together. And there was repentance on many of the leaders. And so the ICOC, after his ouster, didn't want to dissolve because they still felt strongly about their, discipling and all that. And so trying to alter it without the abuses or the amount or whatever. And so there was change. There wasn't this top-down mother church structure and the hierarchical things. That kind of changed. And some of them went back to, more, but they wanted to stay together, and they kind of have. And they still get together for, seminars, conferences, things like that. So there is a connection. They, while it was still with Boston, they had their own publishing house, and I think it's Discipleship Press or something like that, and it's still going, where their authors are doing their books and promoting their things, just like every other group does. And that's been going on for quite a while. And so, again, a lot of things, a lot that's going on there. And as I said, we have an ICOC down by the airport, and as we said last week, they just bought the old, what was First Christian of St. Peter's, which is where the old Mid Rivers was back in the earlier times, across from the post office there near Mid Rivers in Mexico. They just bought that, and it's called Gateway something. And they were meeting out here on K. So there was a plant, a satellite, if you will, out here to the county. And but they're not giant like some of the other things were. And so now there was as we move on, there was also another very major change that took place in this period. And again, like anything, it starts off and it takes a while to percolate and work in and become more common. And so what happened was a rethinking of that restoration vision that our fathers had started with. Now remember, all that's going on, they were so greatly influenced at the time by that, by the Enlightenment, from that rational, empirical, scientific approach to understanding everything. And they applied that to the scriptures. And I don't know if everybody, but that was dominant, not just in our group. And so that was very powerful. And when you bring that lens to things, you see things in certain ways, because that's what that lens kind of directs. Yes?
But you're going back in history now with him in 1963, because in 63, I had heard nothing about a Boston movement.
Well, hold on. This is a change from that.
That's okay.
Okay, this is not Boston at all.
I'm just wanting to verify that.
Remember, we've been trying to document these changes
I know.
that have happened in Churches of Christ over decades.
This is way before Boston.
Well, sure, way before, 20 years. Probably, or 15, 20 years, yes, for sure.
That's when we were married, so that's.
Now, is that when you were at Hardy? Were you there in 63?
Yeah, oh yeah. I got the Jimmy Allen Romans series.
So you had this.
Yeah.
So you understand, you're going to understand this intimately, because you.
No. I have a clue about Romans. I never understood Jimmy Allen. I loved him. He's a great guy. He made Jerry Jones look like a garden hose.
Well,
You mean he said more than Jerry?
He said more than Jerry.
Oh, okay. You mean he was like a garden hose compared to Jerry?
No, the other way around. Jerry's actually Jerry's kind of a mirror image of him.
Okay.
But anyway, he could say more in a 45-minute lecture than most people could absorb in an hour and a half.
Okay, I got you. In other words, okay, a lot of information, a lot of ideas and concepts. Okay, okay. And of course, he was very, you know, I remember when I was going to Maryland Heights. You know, of course, Maryland Heights was a Harding congregation. Most people went there, and you'd always hear about him.
The thing about him was he was almost omnipresent on the Harding campus. I mean, you go over to the student center, he's sitting there lecturing. You go to the basketball courts, he's down there playing ball and lecturing. And he always had a flock of people around him, ready to listen to what
Very
he had to say.
influential. Yes,
He
Joe.
did a campaign here in St. Louis down at one of the big
Yeah, I think I've heard that
stadiums
before.
or-
But that wasn't. Was that around this time, or was that much later?
No, it
was
would've
after
been
we
about
were married.
65.
It was
Okay,
after we
later
were married,
60s.
'cause I attended
Okay.
it.
So anyhow, so next week we'll get into this, and this is major, also, because it's how we theologically think, and really we're on this side of all this, and at that time it was huge, and so we're gonna try to understand it. So thank you very much.